Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bryce Duskin. On this episode, Frayne Olson discusses soybean and wheat markets. Tina Barrett talks about a change in personal property tax reporting. Haishun Yang explains a new software to manage nitrogen rates, and Mitch Stephenson shares information on cattle grazing research. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our market analyst this week. Nationally, farmers now have 39% of the corn crop in the ground. The data from the weekly USDA Crop Progress Report also suggests that 8% of the crop has emerged. In addition, soybean planting progress is now ahead of the 5-year average at 15%. Soybean markets were not able to find help from a trade meeting between the U.S. and China, as the two countries did not report any agreements. However, corn and ethanol supporters did celebrate on Tuesday, as President Donald Trump reaffirmed his support of year-round sales of E15 fuel. We talked with Frayne Tuesday afternoon about the current political pressure and began by asking him about the meeting in China.
Yeah, actually it's very important for the soybean market. China obviously is our #1 customer, and there was a trade delegation that was sent over, and understand these are some really senior people in the Department of Commerce, in the chief negotiator, the trade negotiator's office. So this is a very powerful group that went over to China last week to try and at least sit down face to face with their Chinese counterparts, try and work out at least get the issues on the table and then work out some of the possible solutions to those. Unfortunately, the trade team came away a little bit disappointed. I think there was probably some higher expectations leading up to those discussions. Now understand the discussions are still going on. At least there was agreement that they would continue to talk, so that they didn't get so contentious that they actually broke down and everybody left and said there's no compromise here. So we are getting some feedback from both the administration, Trump administration in Washington, D.C., as well as the President of China and his administration, that yes, we still need to continue to work, we need to talk about this and try to come up with some resolution.
We have been seeing news reports that China has essentially stopped buying U.S. soybeans. Help us understand the historical context of that decision, particularly for this time of year.
Yeah, so one of the things you got to understand about the soybean market is we have very seasonal export patterns. So starting about the U.S. soybean harvest, we start getting a rapid increase in both export sales as well as export shipments. Those tend to drop off a little bit during the winter months, and then during the spring, about the time that the Brazilian harvest is starting, our export pace starts to drop off fairly quickly. So seasonally at this time of year, our soybean exports are very, very low, and our sales into the Chinese market at this time of year are also very low. So even though the reports are coming out that the Chinese are buying 0 U.S. soybeans right now, everything is coming from either Brazil or Argentina. Just to understand, seasonally, that's kind of a normal pattern. It is sending a signal to the marketplace that they're serious about this and that they're taking the trade negotiations again very seriously, and that this is part of the discussion. But we also have to be a little bit cautious that when we hear there's 0 exports into China at this stage of the game, seasonally at this time of year we send very little soybeans in anyway. So again, just to put things in context for everybody.
Corn and ethanol advocates have been lobbying the Trump administration heavily to expand ethanol usage. How big of an impact does ethanol policy have on the corn markets?
Well, actually a very large impact. Again, right now we have the renewable fuel standard, which sets a minimum for the amount of ethanol that needs to be blended into the U.S. fuel supply. The current numbers, we're actually exceeding those. So the current production and blending of ethanol is above what the current mandate is. But those discussions, because it's a very policy-driven discussion, are really important. And there's a couple things going on. First is the RINs, which is really the accounting system that's used by the administration and by the U.S. government to make sure that the amount of fuel or ethanol that needs to be blended is being blended. So there's some discussion about how those RINs are to be counted and kind of the pricing of those, as well as then some exemptions that are also offered to smaller refineries to try and, because of their cost structure, they don't want it to be a financial burden to be able to have to blend off all of the ethanol. So there are some exemptions that are being made right now for smaller or those that are financially stressed manufacturers or the refiners. The moral of the story is the policy is very important. We're getting some negotiations and discussions not only from the ethanol groups, but then also from our gasoline manufacturers sector. And so they're trying to come up with a compromise to say, how can we make this work for everybody? As part of that discussion, there's also some potentially movement from a 10% blend to a 15% blend. Right now there's some technical details that prevent too much 15% blend into our ethanol base. So these are all kind of a floating and maneuvering, the political maneuvering to be able to see what we can work out. It is really critical for the corn market because approximately 40% of our corn goes into the ethanol manufacturing system.
The World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates are due this week. What are the expectations for that report?
Yeah, so the unique thing about the May report is it's the first time the USDA comes out with their formal estimates for the 2018-19 crop year. And so this will be the first vision or first view that we get, not only for expected production, but also for projected usage. So they're going to update the numbers from the old crop, which is the one that's in the bin, as well as give us their first estimates for new crop. The new crop estimates will be the ones that we spend the most time in focusing on. I don't expect any big surprises from the production numbers, but I do expect that the market analysts and traders will spend a lot of time talking or looking at the consumption numbers, in particular the forecast for exports.
Up in your area of the country, spring wheat planting is underway. What is the outlook for that crop?
Yeah, spring wheat planting right now is a little bit behind in our normal pace. We had a kind of a cool late spring. We've had a few sunny days now, and the soil temperatures are rising. Midweek we were having some rain showers, which will set us back a little bit, but the moisture is sure appreciated. Right now, nobody's really panicking when it comes to planting dates and starting to switch crops, but it is a concern. If we don't get some good weather here going to be able to catch up, then the market might getting a little bit more concerned. But at this point, we're behind our normal pace, but it's not a panic yet.
Next week, Doug Simon from Trade-Offs will join us to provide his take on the crop progress and the corn and soybean markets. Language included in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in December of 2017 has changed the way producers report trade of equipment. According to Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business Incorporated, the change affected how Nebraskans report personal property tax on equipment. Tina notes that the change would have affected some producers, especially those who purchase new equipment and trade often. Nebraska lawmakers did pass a short-term fix, but some states have not. We spoke with Tina on Tuesday afternoon and began by asking her about the federal language that caused the issue.
So, back in December we had the big tax reform bill, and one of the things that changed is the way that we report trades. In the past, we've always been able to take any undepreciated amount of an old asset, add it to the boot paid, that cash difference, and call that our new depreciable basis for the new asset. And in the reform bill, they said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Now, when you trade an asset, anything that you got for trade-in value is the sale price of that old asset, and you're going to sell it, and then we're going to take the full value of the new asset and depreciate it. So that shifts our income a little bit, because normally none of that showed up, and it was just deferred gain. So now we're going to recognize that gain on the Form 4797, and it's going to increase our income. The trade-off to that was that they said, all right, well, you're going to get you're going to get a bunch of 179, which is that ability to write off in the first year, and you can have unlimited bonus on everything. So basically said you have unlimited depreciation at least for a few years. So all we need to do from a federal standpoint is we're going to recognize that income, increase depreciation, and probably not make a huge difference.
I was going to ask you about that federal side, how producers should adapt, but at the Nebraska local level, there's some issues that producers need to recognize.
Yeah, and so what we realized right away that was going to happen was it was going to change the way we reported personal property tax, because in the past we've always taken that net value and put that on the personal property tax return. Now we're going to have that full value. And so we realized this early in January, and lawmakers started working on that and finally got at least a temporary fix through. And what they allowed us to do is basically use the old rules for Nebraska personal property for 2 years. So it's a short-term fix. We'll see how that goes. And there's just some unknowns in exactly how all of this federal is going to affect Nebraska, so I'm sure they were a little uneasy in making too big of a change.
You mentioned that 2-year fix. At the end of that 2 years, what happens at that point? Well,
so then it go back to the way that the Nebraska law is written is it goes off of federal depreciated value. So that's why we knew it was going to go up to that higher amount. So we'll see if they want to come back and fix something, or if we need to do something different there.
Other states could be affected. You mentioned Iowa a little bit before, but also a handful of other states.
Right, so there are some states who don't follow the federal levels for that enhanced depreciation, either Section 179 or bonus. Nebraska fully adapts whatever we take on federal, they accept. But some states like Iowa have not done that. So when we're recognizing some of those potentially really large gains on the 4797, we won't be able to offset that with 179. And so those states, and if you're in one of those states, that's going to be a bigger issue, and it could really potentially significantly impact how this goes. So that's going to be a little bit of a difference in that trade. And so it might even be a difference in how you negotiate those trades. And because once you agree on that boot value trade, there may be benefit for you having a high trade-in value or a low trade-in value, and changing where that boot is put. So it's something to think about and definitely talk to your tax preparer about.
Is this retroactive back to January 1?
Sure, yeah. So everything from the federal standpoint, took place effect January 1st, but Nebraska's change did come back to that.
You've also been working on the 2017 Nebraska income averages. Tell us about some of the trends you're seeing.
Yeah, we actually saw an increase in net farm income this year, which was a little surprising for me as well as we were coming through it. But as I started digging into the data, I didn't see a change in crop farm numbers for those operations that are getting 70% of their gross income from crops. But it was really those livestock operations that not necessarily made a lot of money, but lost less than they have in the last couple of years. So we did see a little bit of an overall increase, and that's a positive thing to see.
What about debt levels and family living?
Yeah, those are the two areas that are really pretty concerning. We saw debt levels continue to increase. We actually went up another 10% in average debt load to about 1.3 million per operation. That's 2 years in a row we've seen 10% increases, and we've been seeing those increases since about 2007, pretty steady. So certainly something to be concerned of, that we're continually adding to the debt load that has to be covered. Also concerning is family living. In 2016, we saw almost a 10% decrease and thought we were on our way and making some of those adjustments. But in 2017, they came right back up to our high levels in 2012. So we saw a little bit of that adjustment, but nothing that seems to be sustained. So certainly something producers can still work on.
Next week, Tamara Jackson-Zims, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist, will discuss seedling diseases due to this year's cold spring weather conditions. Knowing how much nitrogen to apply on corn during the growing season can improve the harvest yield. A new computer program developed at UNL simulates fertilizer requirements for corn. Maize-N estimates nitrogen fertilizer requirements based on unique input information. Haishun Yang, UNL Associate Professor of Agronomy, notes the online Maize-N software uses multiple factors such as tillage and weather data to estimate the optimal nitrogen rate. We recently spoke with Haishun about this new technology and its potential impacts in the field.
Maize-N Software is a computer simulation program that can help farmers and crop advisors to assess nitrogen requirement for corn crop. And the principle behind this program is it takes into account of the soil properties, the current weather, and your crop management schemes to assess the yield and the nitrogen contribution from all sources in your field, and then to come up with a recommendation of a nitrogen fertilizer rate. Besides the natural conditions, your management, it also considers the economic factors, which are the prices of your fertilizer and your final product, and to give you the optimum nitrogen rate for your crop.
To obtain the optimum rate of nitrogen for one's crop with the N-Maize software, we further asked Haishun how this online software works.
In principle, it simulates or estimates the nitrogen contributions from every source in the field to estimate the final total requirement, and which also considers the efficiency factors, because they are very important in terms of how much nitrogen can be recovered from your soil, from your management, to come up with the final rate of fertilizer.
When determining the nitrogen fertilizer rate, there are a few factors to consider, such as yield, soil fertility, nitrogen credits, the non-uptake of nitrogen consumption and losses, along with the amount and type of manure being applied.
The ultimate nitrogen requirement for the crop is the yield. Basically, the higher the yield, the more nitrogen you would need. The second largest factor is how much nitrogen can come from soil, which includes the most important one, the soil organic matter mineralization. Second one is how much nitrogen is left over from your previous season or previous crop. If we can figure out these two parts, basically the most important is solved.
Every state in the Corn Belt has its own nitrogen fertilizer rate algorithm formula for corn. However, these formulas tend to lack the response of weather variations, change of location, tillage and residue management, alternatives to soil testing, and economics. These formulas also cause one to guess more about their personal yield goal and nitrogen credits.
The major difference between the conventional method and this Maize-N program is, first of all, the field-specific nature of nitrogen requirement estimation. And second, it's the season-specific, because every field is different, every season is different. If you use the conventional method, very likely the nitrogen rate for each year may not be that different. However, we know that each year is different. For example, this spring has been colder than what most people remember for the previous years. And for that reason, the nitrogen contribution from soil is likely to be lower than your average year. And then if you use the conventional method, very likely you will come up with a not so much different nitrogen rate. However, if you use the Maize-N program, very likely the program will tell you your likely nitrogen rate should be a little bit higher, because the contribution from soil this year is likely lower than your average year.
The cost of the Maize-N software is $35, and you can learn more about the software at cropwatch.unl.edu. According to the USDA, Nebraska ranks #1 in popcorn production. Farmers have banded together to not only produce a high-quality popcorn product, but also market their crops. In 1997, Norm Krug and several of his farming friends joined forces with Aurora Cooperative to form Preferred Popcorn. Preferred now sells popcorn to 70 countries. You can learn more about Preferred Popcorn in the May Nebraska Farmer. Determining how cattle behaviors affect grazing habits is the focus of Mitch Stephenson, a Nebraska Extension range and forage specialist. By using GPS tracking technology, Mitch can determine cattle grazing habits and ultimately manage rangelands more efficiently. We spoke with Mitch to learn more about his research, but began by asking about the importance of rangelands.
So rangelands cover about 23 million acres in the state of Nebraska. Most of that's in the Sandhills region and also in the northwestern part of the state. And these rangelands are extremely important to our beef cow industry, which is about 1.9 million beef cows in the state. It currently ranks us about 4th in the nation. And those cows spend a portion of their time on these rangelands. Some of them are year-round. So not only is it critical for our beef cattle, these rangelands also provide a wealth of ecosystem services, wildlife habitat, water infiltration, soil erosion control, carbon sequestration. These rangelands are extremely important to us as a society, not only just as a product or to produce a product in beef cattle.
One of the benefits of rangelands are the forages they provide. According to Mitch, Nebraska is unique by having highly productive rangelands in close proximity to high productive croplands. This allows producers to use the forage from rangelands during the summer and certain times of the year, and then be able to move cattle to the cropland to use corn stalks and other cropland forages. To document which forages the cattle graze the most, Mitch uses GPS tracking devices.
So I got interested in using GPS collars and tracking devices to monitor how grazing behavior influence some of the plant-animal interactions. So we know that certain behaviors in cattle indicate where they'll go to graze and where they might graze more. So we're really looking at these preferred areas and how cattle go back to those areas over and over again and may utilize those areas more than other areas of the pasture. And so we're really looking at how their behaviors change over time within a pasture as there becomes less and less forage as grazing increases on a pasture. We're also doing some research looking at how cattle utilize some invasive species. And so this is in the Panhandle where the annual invasive grass, cheatgrass, is very common and it's intermixed with a lot of our perennial grasses. And so the goal of this research is to really look and see how animal behavior can be employed to target grazing on the cheatgrass at certain times during the year, to really focus the utilization of that as a forage while also reducing the amount of that species that goes to seed. And so we're looking at that from the standpoint of, can we graze it really hard in the early spring, get off of it, and let the perennial grasses grow uninhibited without grazing. And so we're using GPS tracking to see, okay, when are cattle going to those areas with a lot of cheatgrass, and then when are they grazing on areas with mostly the perennial grasses, to see where that shifts in their selectivity.
Since this research documents which forages the cattle are selecting, it also shows how these grazing strategies influence the plant communities.
So looking at everything from continuous grazing, where cattle are placed in a pasture all summer long during the growing season, and how that influences spatial heterogeneity of plant species and structure and height, as well as production at different topographic positions across the sandhills. And also looking at that in comparison to very intensive rotational grazing strategy, as well as a moderate grazing strategy of 3 or 4 pastures. And so a lot of that research they're looking at to really see how these different grazing strategies influence some of the plant communities, and how we can use these strategies, one, to improve efficiency of our beef cattle production, also looking at how it can manage for some of these more beneficial species that we want to see out there for livestock production, but also see how it affects plant communities that might have other ecosystem services for maybe wildlife species or some of these other services that are also important to have on rangelands.
Al Dutcher is off this week. In place of his usual forecasts, we talked with Nebraska State climatologist Martha Shulski to learn about the Nebraska State Climate Office's new additions for 2018.
So the Nebraska Mesonet is a weather monitoring program that's run out of the State Climate Office at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and we monitor the current weather conditions around the state. We started in 1981 with 5 locations, and this year we'll be up to about 70, and we're represented in about 47 Nebraska counties, and folks can get information on temperature and humidity, how much rain we received, what the wind speed and direction are like, as well as solar radiation and soil temperature under bare soil at 4-inch depth, and then soil moisture at 4 different levels.
The Nebraska State Climate Office receives current weather data from the Nebraska Mesonet stations in order to help farmers make smart crop management decisions. To continue to improve their weather data, there will be 7 new weather stations in Nebraska for 2018.
So for 2018, we do have some exciting developments. So we have 7 new weather stations going in, thanks to some sponsors around the state. So we have 5 locations going in eastern Nebraska, 1 in Lincoln, 1 near Plattsmouth, which is a new county that we're into, and we have 1 at Lee and Decatur, a 3rd site actually going in at Meade at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center. That's to support the phenotyping efforts that's going on there. And then we have 2 new stations in 2 new counties in western Nebraska, Garden County and Morrill County. We have stations at Oshkosh and Broadwater. So it's very exciting to put in all these new stations in 1 year.
In addition to the 7 new weather stations for 2018, Martha shares their latest products as well.
Some new products we have is solar radiation for this year, so we can look at how much sunlight are these plants? Are we receiving? We can look at a satellite view. It's called GO-16. It's a geostationary satellite that kind of focuses on this part of the country, and it's a much higher resolution, so you get a really nice perspective of the landscape and the cloud cover, and gives a really nice view of Nebraska. So when we have a snow event, and then you can see a really nice snow cover pattern when the sky is clear. Or during the summertime, you can see convection and all of these showers that are more localized, and what does that look like from space? So it's a nice perspective.
In order to observe all of this data, the Nebraska Climate Office provides a monthly climate summary on their website, nsco.unl.edu.
So what we do at the Nebraska State Climate Office is put out a monthly climate summary. So it puts the most recent month into perspective, look at how temperature and precipitation ranked, look at drought conditions, how those have changed over the month, and then look at our Mesonet extremes. What was the highest temperature, lowest temperature, the highest wind gust, those kinds of things. And then also provide both a short-term and a long-term climate outlook. So what will temperature and precipitation conditions look like in the upcoming season? So users can find that in our monthly climate summary on our website, and that's nsco.unl.edu. And for April, we had a very interesting month. We had the blizzard come through. It was the coldest, second coldest April on record, behind 1920. It was first coldest for Lincoln and a handful of other locations around Nebraska. So it was quite cold. It was a little bit on the dry side, not for the part of Nebraska that experienced the heavy snowfall, which was kind of south central and north central Nebraska. But for the rest of the state, it was a little bit on the dry side. So we cover information like that in the monthly climate summary.
Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on soybean and wheat markets, personal property tax reporting, a new software to manage nitrogen rates, and cattle grazing research. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Doug Simon from Trade-Offs will be our corn and soybean market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bryce Duskett. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.